I'm sure we're between us capable of coming up with more questions and answers, but I know I've been taking up a lot of your time. So maybe just the last two. One is a kind of question that is maybe somewhat critical of Lacanian, despite the amazing fecundity and productivity of the multiple variant means of how to apply and think das Ding, which, you know, as a little footnote, is a romance that I'm fully part of. You know, I just kind of can't stop trying to do this theorization and think about it. One question that sometimes sneaks up on me is if I was an ardent Freudian, not in the sense that Lacanian says, well, you know, but would I not, if Freud is somewhere hearing this, is he not like going, dudes, I used this concept very briefly in the project, and you've picked up this ball and you've run with it and you've elaborated in all sorts of different ways. So my one question is, if we were to be critical of how this amazing series of elaborations, what is lost in routine Lacanian social theoretical and Lacanian formulations of das Ding, what gets lost from Freud's theorization? And I suppose you can also hear in the subtext of that question is, for Freud, we've got something which is really crucial, the wieder zu fiden, excuse my horrendous ability or inability to do anything with German, this wish, this want to find again. Is that one of the things that possibly gets dropped out of the concept? Or I suppose basically the question is, in what ways do Lacanians run the risk of doing an injustice to the initial Freudian articulation of the concept?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll give a brief answer, which is all too schematic, but I think it reflects my own basic conviction about this. I think that what gets left behind is what Lacan very intentionally wants to leave behind, which is Freud's own formulation of the Oedipus complex. The Oedipal dynamic, which is focused on tearing the child away from the mother under the sort of the threat of castration and the sort of imposition of a sort of threat from the father, implicitly or explicitly. That whole dynamic is being replaced with the theory of das Ding, as is insofar as we take das Ding as the sort of primordial site or incitement to anxiety, then the child is already taking its own distance in a limited way from the maternal figure, the maternal being, maternal person. And I think so in that sense, Lacan, I would say he takes himself, I think it's in Seminar 7 that he says this, that basically, Seminar 10 rather, the one on anxiety, where he basically says, and increasingly says it in subsequent seminars, that Freud's Oedipus complex was really Freud's own myth, which we do well to gently, respectfully rewrite. And so I think actually this is, for me, one of the biggest reasons why I kept returning to das Ding, despite Lacan's so much, not completely, but predominantly drifting away from talking about it. I come back to it because I think it has so much to do with what Lacan himself was trying to get. Because after all, what he calls the paternal metaphor is the way of succeeding in replacing in some sense, the desire of the mother with the law of the father. Well, what he calls in his formulation of the paternal metaphor, the desire of the mother, seems to me, had he elaborated it, it would have worked out perfectly. Das Ding is the heart of this, what in the desire of the mother must be stabilized by the law, the name of the father. His version of the Oedipus is therefore really focused on exactly this problematic, whether you call it das Ding or not. So then to the wieder zu finden, what has to be refound, what is that? Well, we know it's a famous kind of fun Lacanian phrase that what needs to be refound is what was never possessed in the first place. Well, that's true, of course. But I think that here again, Das Ding plays a wonderful role for us. What is most deeply wieder zu finden, to be recovered again, is precisely a kind of openness, a kind of disorienting open horizon, which is precisely in a certain sense what Das Ding is pointing toward. It's a kind of void in which I can't get to again speak Wittgensteinian, I can't know my way about. I don't know where I am with this thing. What the hell is this?
Mm.
And I think that this is where I find, and I'm sure I'm showing my prejudices as more deeply rooted in philosophy in a way than in psychoanalysis. But I find this opening on to this, yes, deep ontological aperture, a kind of horizon. I find that to be really pregnant with lots of valuable stuff.
Last one, Das Ding and psychosis. And the reason I ask is, not so long ago, I wrote a paper on melancholia, which had a little bit of case material in. And then one of the people who ended up commenting on it had asked, well, is the melancholic object not actually Das Ding? And just to back up a little bit more, one of the references in the paper was to the work of Russell Grigg and his notion that in melancholia, if we're understanding melancholia as part of psychotic structure, what one confronts is not an imaginarizable object, but rather one confronts the burning object, the object without the filters of some kind of an imaginarizable defenses, so to speak, or filters, but also an object that burns, an object that's traumatic in a kind of raw and undiluted way. Anyway, so the commentator had then on the paper said, well, maybe what you're talking about when you're thinking about this unshielded object that burns, this unshielded object, which is a kind of naked traumatic object, is Das Ding in melancholia. So I kind of like that formulation, although I've also got some reservations about it. But anyways, that's just a sort of an entree onto the question. I mean, what did you have any thoughts on that? Not necessarily about melancholia, but just the status of Das Ding within in psychosis. And if psychosis could be very loosely considered a subjective structure which is not equipped with quite the same linguistic desiring, name of the father, resources as one has in neurosis, what are the implications of that?
Briefly, because great question. I love it, especially the relation to the burning. I think of the famous Freud's famous dream of the child who comes to the father and says, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" What I would say, to just be really brief, but hopefully kind of go to the core of at least one core of this question, is that both in relation to melancholia and in relation to psychosis, I would say the melancholic and the psychotic, both in different ways, are overwhelmed by Das Ding. However, either in the melancholic fixation or in the psychotic delusion, they supply themselves with a kind of intended all-purpose filler for the abyss of Das Ding. So if you take the other great topic, which I couldn't fit into the religion book, was, of course, a discussion of Schreber and his relation to God, as he was going to be the wife of God. His fantasy with God is this kind of insane psychotic elaboration of God's lust for him, which is basically going to tear him to pieces and so on. Well, it strikes me as not obvious, but irresistibly attractive as a thesis, that what we're really dealing with here in the psychotic is an unbelievably traumatizing, uncontrolled opening up of the abyss in the eyes of every person I meet. The brother of a very dear friend of mine is psychotic, and I had a lot of time to spend with him and get to know him, and he'll talk quite honestly, although with a limit of his self-reflection, but he'll talk about what does it mean to be psychotic, and one of his big things is he has to count. He has to keep count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. He's constantly counting, as if keeping count avoids the abyss. And when he's with another human being, he finds that meeting the gaze of the other, this I find fascinating, is both extremely dangerous because the gaze of the other threatens to destroy you. It gets inside you. It's like the psychotic who doesn't know how to understand the television set in the room. Is the television set creating this terrible series of things in my brain, or is my brain causing the television set to do that? In the psychotic, this description of this brother of my friend, he says he has to keep up the counting and keep his eyes on the other's eyes, but making sure that they don't succeed in invading his body. So it's this kind of like, in one sense, it's constantly evoking something abyssal. It's like he is, to be psychotic is to be held over, as Heidegger puts it, held out into the nothing. But it's constantly, the nothing is constantly being, you might say, moment by moment, prevented, obviated in some way by all these psychotic obsessions and delusions. Anyway, that would be my brief comment on that.
That's lovely. In as much as one of the things I think that you're alluding to there is a concept we didn't speak about, but is the notion of sublimation at some level. And the abyssal, one way of trying to deal with the abyssal is presumably through sublimation. And part of what had motivated the question actually was not simply thinking about melancholia, but thinking about what seems to be the reoccurring importance of a whole series of phenomena to deal with religion, art, and science in psychosis itself. Mm-hmm. To risk a huge generalization, they seem to be, they seem to be sort of privileged fields through which there is an attempt at the sublimation, or maybe just the dealing with this abyssal. And anyway, it just seemed to me, it seemed to me fascinating, and maybe one way to, I mean, you've just done it obviously in terms of the sacred and religion, but it would be interesting to see a lengthy treatment of the role of dusting in various facets of psychosis, particularly in respect of responses to how sublimation or very individualistic variants of sublimation might be seen almost as a way as a treatment of psychosis.
And very tiny last note, the book on religion, the Embracing the Void that I've written is very interested in this, what I call symptomatic dimension, that the sense of the sacred is the sense of our very, very primordial exposure to something abyssal, something open, something dreadful, dreadfully indeterminate. And that is the space in which we basically adopt reverence, a kind of terrified but also thrilled ontological experience. But I also track through the various religions I examine, all the way from Greek paganism to Judaism to Christianity and other, Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and so on. I track also what I call the symptomatic reaction in these religions, which is exactly parallel. It's not simply to be called psychotic, but it provides some of the same function of my friend counting, monitoring the meeting of the eyes to make sure that he always has the advantage over the other person. He's not being invaded by their gaze. He's controlling it, with enormous constant effort. This is actually quite parallel to a whole catalog of different symptomatic strategies by which religion controls its very exposure to something that is transportingly, thrillingly, magnetically abyssal. We're both, you might say, by our very nature, we're drawn toward this edge of being. But we are also obviously terrorized by it. And we come up with all kinds of means of wanting to be exposed, but also wanting to control that exposure. And that makes this enormous symptomatic tension inside the whole religious phenomenon as I analyze it.
Rick, thank you so much for your time. I suppose in closing, all there is really to say is not just a thank you, but there's the recommendation for all colleagues and friends and people who subscribe to this channel to get hold of these two new books by Rick's and give them the attention and the readership that they deserve. So thanks again, Rick, and hopefully I'll catch up with you at some point.
Very, very appreciative, Derek. I really enjoyed your questions and hope that somebody else out there somewhere finds something useful in my answers.